The day started like any other. The sun cast golden rays over my peaceful home as I sipped my morning coffee, enjoying the silence before the world outside fully awoke. My house, nestled in a quiet neighborhood, had always been my sanctuary, a place where I had built memories, celebrated milestones, and found comfort after long days. Little did I know, everything was about to change in the most devastating way possible. I had always followed the Homeowners Association (HOA) rules. I paid my dues on time, kept my lawn manicured, and ensured my property adhered to their seemingly endless guidelines. Yet, the HOA had always been a looming presence, with its board members eager to enforce their authority over every minor infraction. I had seen my neighbors struggle against them, fined for trivial things like the color of their mailbox or the height of their fence. But I had never imagined I would be the next target. That morning, as I finished my coffee, I heard an unusual noise outside. It was a deep rumbling sound, like a low growl shaking the ground. My stomach twisted with unease as I stepped onto my front porch. What I saw made my heart stop. A massive construction vehicle, a bulldozer, was rolling onto my property. I blinked, thinking I must be hallucinating. Behind it, more vehicles followed, men in uniforms marked with the HOA insignia, their faces impassive as they surveyed my home. Panic surged through me as I rushed down the steps, waving my hands. "Excuse me. What is going on?" I called out, my voice shaking with a mix of anger and fear. One of the men, a tall figure in a neatly pressed suit, stepped forward. I recognized him immediately, Mr. Caldwell, the head of the HOA. His smug expression only fueled my anxiety. "We're here to enforce the HOA's new regulations," he said coolly. "Enforce what?" I demanded. "This is my home." Mr. Caldwell pulled a clipboard from under his arm, flipping through pages as if he were reading off a grocery list. "According to our updated community planning rules, your property does not align with the aesthetic and structural standards of the neighborhood. As such, it must be removed to make way for future development." I stared at him, unable to comprehend his words. "You're telling me you're demolishing my house?" "That's correct," he said, as though he were discussing the weather. My blood ran cold. "This is illegal. You can't just tear down someone's home." "We have full authority," he replied, handing me a paper filled with legal jargon. "You were notified last month." My mind raced. I had received no such notice. I had checked my mail regularly, paid all my fees. There had been no warnings, no messages, no signs that my house was in danger. Yet here they were, standing on my lawn with bulldozers, ready to erase my home from existence. A wave of helplessness washed over me as I tried to process the insanity of the situation. The walls that had protected me, the rooms where I had lived and laughed, were all at risk of vanishing in a matter of hours. Desperation clawed at my chest. "You can't do this," I whispered, gripping the paper so tightly my knuckles turned white. "This is my home." Mr. Caldwell gave a dismissive shrug. "You can file a complaint. But for now, step aside. We have work to do." I watched in horror as the bulldozer rumbled forward, its enormous blade reflecting the morning light. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. They weren't bluffing. They were going to destroy everything I had worked for. My heart pounded as I stumbled back, my mind reeling. How could this be happening? How could they just decide that my home, my sanctuary, needed to be torn down without so much as a warning? My hands trembled as I clutched the legal document Mr. Caldwell had handed me, my eyes scanning the fine print for any loophole, any hope that I could use to stop this madness. But the words were convoluted, buried under layers of bureaucratic nonsense designed to confuse and discourage anyone from fighting back. The HOA had covered all their bases. They had planned this. They had waited until I was vulnerable, alone, and unprepared. I wasn't going to let them win. Gritting my teeth, I straightened my back and marched up to Mr. Caldwell, who stood watching the bulldozer creep closer to my home like a vulture circling its prey. "You don't have the right to do this," I spat. "I never received any notice. I never signed anything. You're trespassing on my property." Mr. Caldwell raised a condescending brow. "Our records show that you were informed a month ago. It's not our fault if you chose to ignore it." "Liar," I snapped, my voice shaking with fury. "I check my mail every single day. You never sent anything." He smirked, as if my anger amused him. "Perhaps it got lost. But that's not our problem now, is it?" The bulldozer's engine roared louder, the ground vibrating beneath my feet. My home, my life, was seconds away from destruction. I did the only thing I could think of. I ran. I sprinted toward my house, throwing myself in front of the bulldozer, my arms stretched wide. The operator inside hit the brakes, the massive machine groaning to a halt just feet from me. Dust swirled in the air as silence fell over the yard. Gasps erupted from the small crowd that had begun to gather, neighbors peering from their windows, whispering amongst themselves. Some held their phones up, recording the spectacle. "Get out of the way," Mr. Caldwell ordered, his voice sharp. "No." I planted my feet, defiance surging through me like fire. "You're going to have to go through me first." A flicker of uncertainty passed over his face before he regained his composure. "Don't be dramatic. This is a legal matter. You have no grounds to fight this." "Then take me to court," I shot back. "You're not demolishing my house today. Not while I'm standing here." The tension crackled between us. The construction workers shifted uncomfortably, glancing at each other as if unsure of what to do next. The driver inside the bulldozer hesitated, his hands gripping the controls. Mr. Caldwell sighed, rubbing his temple as though I were nothing more than an inconvenience. "Fine," he said finally. "We'll give you 24 hours to vacate. But after that, there's nothing you can do." I didn't respond. I didn't need to. I had bought myself time, and that was enough, for now. As the HOA officials retreated, I turned to my neighbors, desperation in my eyes. "Did anyone see them deliver a notice to my house?" I called out. A murmur ran through the crowd, but no one stepped forward. Some averted their gazes, others shuffled their feet awkwardly. Fear. That's what I saw in their eyes. They had all been bullied by the HOA before. They knew the consequences of speaking up. Except for one voice. I never saw them deliver anything. I spun around to see an elderly man, Mr. Thompson, stepping forward. He had lived in the neighborhood for decades, his presence like an unshakable oak tree among younger, more submissive homeowners. "Every morning, I sit on my porch and read the newspaper," he continued. "If someone had delivered an eviction notice, I would have seen it." Hope sparked in my chest. "Would you be willing to testify to that?" Mr. Thompson met my gaze, his jaw set in determination. "Absolutely." For the first time that day, I felt something other than fear. I felt the stirrings of a fight. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard the roar of the bulldozer, saw the arrogant smirk on Mr. Caldwell's face, felt the crushing weight of helplessness threatening to consume me. But I wasn't helpless. Not anymore. At dawn, I was already making calls. First, to a lawyer, a real bulldog of a man named Eric Wallace, who specialized in property disputes. Then, to every local news station that would listen. If the HOA thought they could quietly erase my home from existence, they were about to learn just how wrong they were. By mid-morning, a news van was parked in front of my house, a reporter setting up her microphone while a cameraman adjusted his angle. Neighbors peeked out of their homes, drawn by the presence of the media. Some still looked wary, afraid of HOA retaliation, but others were starting to step forward. Mr. Thompson stood beside me, arms crossed, his expression one of grim determination. "They're not going to like this," he muttered. "Good," I replied, my jaw set. "They need to know they can't get away with this." Before the interview could begin, a sleek black SUV pulled up to the curb. The door swung open, and out stepped Mr. Caldwell, his face a mask of controlled fury. Behind him, 2 other HOA board members followed, their suits crisp and their gazes icy. "What do you think you're doing?" Caldwell snapped, marching toward me. "This is a private community matter. You have no right to involve the media." I smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "I have every right to defend my home." The reporter, sensing the tension, turned her microphone toward Caldwell. "Sir, do you have a comment on why the HOA is attempting to demolish this home without proper notice?" Caldwell's eyes flickered with irritation. "This homeowner has been in violation of multiple HOA bylaws for years. We are simply enforcing community regulations." "What violations?" I shot back. "Name one that justifies tearing down my entire house." He hesitated for a fraction of a second, just long enough for the reporter to catch it. "According to some neighbors, there was never an eviction notice delivered," she pressed. "Is it possible this process was mishandled?" Caldwell's jaw clenched. "That's a baseless accusation. Our records are airtight." "Then why didn't Mr. Thompson see any notice being delivered?" I challenged. The elderly man stepped forward. "I've lived here longer than any of you. I know what goes on in this neighborhood. And I swear on my life, no one from the HOA ever delivered a thing to this house." Murmurs rippled through the gathered crowd. People were starting to doubt. Starting to question. Caldwell's face darkened. "This is a waste of time. The demolition is proceeding as scheduled." "No, it's not," a new voice cut in. Everyone turned as Eric Wallace, my lawyer, strode onto the scene, briefcase in hand. His expression was one of quiet confidence, the kind of man who had won battles like this 100 times before. "I've reviewed the HOA's paperwork," Wallace continued, flipping open his briefcase and pulling out a thick stack of documents. "And I found some serious discrepancies." Caldwell stiffened. "What are you talking about?" Wallace smiled, a predator sensing weakness. For one, there's no actual demolition permit on file with the city. You can't legally tear this house down. Gasps echoed from the crowd. Even the reporter looked stunned. And even if you had a permit, Wallace went on, you failed to provide proper written notice to the homeowner, which is a direct violation of due process. Caldwell's composure cracked for the first time. That's ridiculous. We have the authority. You don't have anything, Wallace interrupted, his voice razor-sharp. In fact, if you so much as touch this house, I will personally see to it that you and the entire HOA board are sued for unlawful eviction and property damage. Silence fell over the street. Caldwell's face was a mask of rage, but he knew he was cornered. If he pushed forward, it wouldn't just be a legal disaster, it would be a public relations nightmare. The reporter turned back to me. It looks like you may have just saved your home. I exhaled, the tension in my chest finally loosening. This isn't just about me. It's about standing up to people who think they can bulldoze over anyone they want. Caldwell's fists clenched, his frustration palpable. Without another word, he turned on his heel and stormed back to his SUV. His board members followed, their confidence shaken. As the crowd began to disperse, neighbors murmuring to one another, I finally let myself breathe. The battle wasn't over yet, but I had won this round. And I wasn't backing down. The fight was far from over. While the HOA had been temporarily stopped in their tracks, I knew they would regroup, find loopholes, and come back with another plan to try and take my home away. That was their nature, relentless, arrogant, and convinced of their own authority. But they had underestimated me. I spent the next few days gathering every piece of documentation I could find, property records, past communications with the HOA, city zoning laws, anything that could further prove my case. My lawyer, Eric Wallace, assured me that we had solid ground to stand on, but he also warned me that this was far from the end. They're going to try something else, he said, sipping his coffee as we sat across from each other in my kitchen. Caldwell isn't the type to accept defeat quietly. I nodded, gripping my mug tightly. Let them try. I'm ready. And sure enough, they did. 2 days later, I received an official-looking letter in the mail. It was stamped with the HOA's emblem and addressed to me in bold, impersonal lettering. My heart pounded as I ripped it open. The letter was filled with legal jargon, but the message was clear. They were suing me for violating community standards and attempting to defame the HOA through my public actions. They were demanding fines, legal fees, and immediate compliance with their previous orders. I clenched my fists, my blood boiling. They were trying to bury me in paperwork, hoping I'd give up out of sheer exhaustion. I picked up my phone and called Wallace. They just declared war, I said, reading the letter aloud. Wallace chuckled darkly. Good. That means they're desperate. By the end of the week, I was back in court, this time, not just to defend my home, but to go on the offensive. Wallace had filed a countersuit against the HOA, citing harassment, unlawful eviction attempts, and damages. The courtroom was packed. Reporters sat in the back, their cameras rolling. Some of my neighbors had shown up, some to support me, others just to watch the drama unfold. And, of course, Caldwell and his board members sat stiffly at their table, their expressions a mix of irritation and barely concealed nervousness. The judge, a stern woman with sharp eyes, flipped through the stack of documents in front of her. Mr. Caldwell, she said, peering over her glasses, I have reviewed your claims against Mr. Sullivan, and I have a few concerns. Caldwell cleared his throat. Your Honor, we have been more than patient with Mr. Sullivan's repeated violations of community guidelines. The judge held up a hand, silencing him. What I don't understand is why there is no written record of an eviction notice, no city-approved demolition permit, and no evidence that due process was followed. Caldwell's face turned red. We were operating under emergency provisions. Wallace stood. Your Honor, those emergency provisions don't apply in this case. The HOA had no legal authority to attempt to remove my client from his home. The judge nodded. I agree. Murmurs filled the courtroom. Caldwell's jaw tightened, but he remained silent. And furthermore, the judge continued, flipping through another set of documents, this lawsuit against Mr. Sullivan appears to be retaliatory in nature. I am dismissing the HOA's claims against him. A stunned silence filled the room. And as for Mr. Sullivan's countersuit, she went on, there is sufficient evidence to move forward with claims of harassment and damages. Caldwell looked like he had swallowed a lemon. His board members exchanged nervous glances. The judge's gavel came down. Court adjourned. As I stepped outside, a wave of relief washed over me. Reporters rushed forward, cameras flashing, microphones shoved in my direction. What are your next steps? One asked. I smiled. Making sure this never happens to anyone else. Caldwell stormed past me, his face thunderous, but I didn't care. The battle wasn't just about my home anymore. It was about standing up to those who thought they could bully others into submission. And I had just shown them that they were wrong. The courtroom victory was a significant blow to Caldwell and his HOA board, but I knew they wouldn't give up so easily. People like him didn't accept defeat, they schemed, manipulated, and found new ways to come back swinging. I wasn't about to let my guard down. In the days following the ruling, the neighborhood was buzzing. Some people cheered me on, congratulating me for standing up against the HOA's corruption. Others, mostly those who had sided with Caldwell, glared at me as I walked down the street. It didn't matter. I had won, and they knew it. But then, the retaliation began. It started small. First, my mailbox was knocked over. At first, I thought it was just an accident, maybe a reckless driver or a prank. But then it happened again. And again. Each time, I replaced it, and each time, it was destroyed overnight. Next, I started receiving anonymous complaints to the city about my property, false reports about unkempt grass, noise violations, and alleged safety hazards. It was a clear attempt to get the city involved and make my life miserable. I wasn't stupid. I knew exactly who was behind it. Then, one morning, I woke up to find my car had been towed. Furious, I called the tow company and discovered that someone had reported my vehicle as abandoned on the street. It was a blatant lie. I parked in my driveway every single night. I retrieved my car, paid the ridiculous towing fee, and filed a police report. But I knew that even with legal victories, there were some battles that wouldn't be fought in court. Caldwell and his cronies were playing dirty. So I decided to hit back. I started digging deeper into the HOA's finances. I had already uncovered questionable practices before, but now I was determined to find something that would bring Caldwell down for good. With the help of my lawyer and a few friendly neighbors, I filed a request for the HOA's financial records under state transparency laws. They were legally obligated to provide them. What we found was worse than I had imagined. Caldwell had been funneling HOA funds into personal expenses, trips, expensive dinners, even payments to a personal business under a fake name. Tens of thousands of dollars were unaccounted for. I compiled everything into a neat little report and sent it straight to the authorities. And then, I waited. A week later, the bomb dropped. News spread like wildfire. Reports of financial fraud, embezzlement, and illegal activities tied directly to Caldwell and his inner circle were now public knowledge. Investigators had been called in, and subpoenas were issued. I stood outside my house when the police cars arrived at Caldwell's home. He came out, red-faced and fuming, barking at the officers as they handcuffed him. I crossed my arms, watching as he was escorted into the back of the police cruiser. He turned and saw me. "This isn't over," he snarled. I just smiled. "Yeah, it is." The downfall of Caldwell sent shockwaves through the entire neighborhood. The once feared HOA president, who had ruled with an iron fist, was now facing multiple felony charges for fraud, embezzlement, and misuse of community funds. The evidence I had gathered was airtight, and the authorities wasted no time in pressing charges. I watched the news reports as they covered the scandal, interviewing residents who had suffered under Caldwell's rule. Some were former supporters who now felt betrayed. Others, like me, had always known he was corrupt but finally had the proof to expose him. But even with Caldwell gone, the battle wasn't over. In the weeks following his arrest, the HOA scrambled to recover. The remaining board members were either resigning in disgrace or trying to distance themselves from the scandal. However, I knew that if we didn't act fast, someone just as bad as Caldwell could take over. That's when my neighbors approached me with a crazy idea. "Why don't you run for HOA president?" I almost laughed at the suggestion. Me? Running the very organization I had fought against? But the more I thought about it, the more it made sense. If we wanted real change, we needed someone willing to fix the broken system. So, with the support of the neighborhood, I put my name on the ballot. And I won. Becoming the HOA president was never part of my plan, but it gave me a chance to do what Caldwell never did, actually serve the community. The first thing I did was push for complete transparency. No more hidden financials, no more ridiculous fines, and no more harassment. I implemented policies that required board members to be accountable for every decision. We also refunded as much stolen money as possible back to the residents. Some homeowners were shocked to receive checks in the mail for fines they had paid years ago under Caldwell's regime. And as for the ridiculous rules that had plagued our neighborhood? Gone. No more power trips, no more arbitrary punishments, just simple guidelines that made sense. It wasn't easy. Some of Caldwell's old allies tried to resist, but with the majority of homeowners on my side, they had no choice but to step down. Slowly, the neighborhood started to change. Months later, I stood outside my house, looking around at the place I had fought so hard for. It finally felt like home again. Neighbors waved as they passed by, no longer afraid of surprise fines or threats from a corrupt HOA. People were planting flowers in their yards without worrying about getting approval. Kids played basketball in driveways without fear of complaints. The dark days of Caldwell's reign were over. One afternoon, I received a letter from the county courthouse. I opened it and smirked. Caldwell had taken a plea deal. He was sentenced to 3 years in prison for his crimes. It was finally over. I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the past year lift off my shoulders. I had fought back against corruption, won, and even found myself in a leadership role I never expected. As I looked around at my neighborhood, I realized something. Sometimes, the best way to beat the system is to change it from the inside. And that's exactly what I did.